Welcome to Serious Rock Talk Crime.
A mysterious death occurred back in the early hours of July the 3rd, 1971, in an upscale apartment in Paris. It was a death which continues to interest people. There's an Edgar Allan Poe-ish twist to it all, with the body of a handsome youth, a body left unburied, packed in dry ice for 3 days. There's a gothic element, with a pale-faced, beautiful woman, her mind detached by the terrible tragedy before her, wandering without purpose. And finally, there's France's famous bureaucracy, convoluted, condescending, and dismissive, creating unintentional chaos. Underlying it all is the inevitability of the narrative. We ask ourselves, how else could this have ended? How else could Jim Morrison have died? Hello, I'm Dr. Ian Clarke, and you are listening to Serious Rock Talk Crime. Yes, a mystery indeed. Was it an accident, suicide, conspiracy, murder? Let's talk about a very famous cemetery in Paris. Let's review some of the denizens. Frédéric Chopin, Oscar Wilde, Marcel Proust, Edith Piaf, Molière, Eugene Delacroix, Rossini, Sarah Bernhardt. Internationally famous people, obviously. Paris cemeteries have many prominent residents, but the number one attraction, the number one grave, so to speak, is that American who died in 1971, the rock singer and poet James Douglas Morrison, of the rock group The Doors. Let's think about that for a moment, that out of all the graves in these beautiful cemeteries, Jim Morrison is the star attraction. In other words, his appeal, his fame, has not died, has not diminished with time, and he has been gone for over 50 years. Those of you who have followed our podcast over the seasons will know of my predilection for The Doors, and I used the word predilection carefully because often it seems to be a bit of a bias. There are many songs of The Doors that I do not find appealing. So why do I find this band, from a macro sense anyway, appealing? Well, maybe it's a combination of elements, and we will get to that. Suffice it to say that I've been to see Morrison's grave in Paris twice. Now, the narrative of The Doors is indeed heavy with Gothic elements. In fact, the term Gothic rock was coined back in 1967 to describe their music. You have the music itself, which is often dark, detached, nihilistic possibly, a sonorous organ in the background. You have a lead singer, a handsome young man given to drug and alcohol excess, and he dies under somewhat mysterious circumstances in the beautiful City of Lights. But we'll get to that too. In other words, you can see the vector starting to cross. We are making an engaging mystery. All right, let's get some context. Paris was to be a new beginning for Jim Morrison, to escape the madness of his rock and roll lifestyle in the U.S., to try and get clean and shake off his drug and alcohol addiction. As with many before him, Morrison was to discover, the hard way, that the allures of Paris for an addictive personality would prove impossible to resist. Add to that the company of his longtime girlfriend, Pam Courson, herself a heroin addict, and Morrison's equal in unfettered behavior. And perhaps the writing was already on the wall. It has been stated by those who knew him best that Morrison had planned to leave the Doors following their last album, L.A. Woman. Their contract with Elektra Records had been fulfilled, and he had plenty of money to set himself up as a poet. At that time, he seemed to be going through a deep depression, worsened by his drug and alcohol consumption, which was becoming increasingly frequent. His excesses were even causing him heart problems, despite his young age. In fact, his heart had been damaged by a bout of rheumatic fever when he was a boy. When Morrison arrived in Paris, he was almost unrecognizable from the slender, elegant, leather-clad singer. Excessive beer drinking had bloated both his figure and his face. A long, unkempt beard and mustache completed the metamorphosis. He was burnt out. His alcohol problems had blunted his creative songwriting, and his participation as lead singer of The Doors had been erratic at best. A 40-day trial, after being charged with exposing himself on stage in Miami, was still awaiting a verdict, and a possible 6-month prison sentence was hanging over his head. A shy, gentle, artistic man when sober, Morrison was a Jekyll and Hyde personality. When drunk, he was unpredictable, he had a fiery temper, and was prone to excessive and wild behavior. Members of The Doors referred to this Mr. Hyde personality simply as Jimbo. Courson was already in Paris and had rented an apartment before Jim Morrison joined her. Pam Courson had been Morrison's long-term girlfriend since 1965, although neither of them were rarely faithful. Ray Manzarek, The Doors keyboard player, said of Courson that he, quote, never knew another person who could so complement Jim's bizarreness. She was his other half. Courson had been staying with Count Jean de Bretuil, an aristocratic drug dealer who moved between London, where he was an intimate of Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg, and Paris, where his drug dealing continued, and he doubtless was the main supplier of Courson's heroin. So already Morrison was moving into a toxic and unhealthy environment, far removed from any hope of a healthy respite and a recovery. If you wish to know more about Jean de Bretuil, visit 60spop.blogspot.com. That's 60spop. Search for the Count, a true angel of death, if there was any. At first, the couple stayed at the Georges V before moving on to L'Hôtel, and then to a rented apartment at 17 Rue Beautreillas. There's no doubt that Morrison loved and appreciated Paris for its literary and artistic cultural heritage. He was living in the city of his literary idols, so Père Lachaise Cemetery was one of his first stops. In fact, Morrison told a friend that when he died, he wanted to be buried at Père Lachaise, and his friend remembered that. The last night of Jim Morrison's life, according to Pam Courson, was marked by its normality, its uneventfulness. Dinner at a Chinese restaurant, and later at the Action Lafayette Theater, a film. And then they returned to their apartment and went to bed. Then, according to Courson's police report, she was awakened by Morrison's labored breathing, but he told her he was going to take a bath, and it was okay. She found him there, dead at dawn. A doctor was called on the morning of July the 3rd and listed the official cause of death as heart failure, though no autopsy was performed. That was the official, accepted version, but discrepancies soon became apparent, and the rumor mill began in earnest. Courson at first denied Morrison had died. Journalists who had heard rumors of his death were told he was in hospital. The Doors manager, Bill Siddons, was told Morrison was fine before Courson admitted the truth. We do know that Morrison was put on a bed, wrapped in plastic, and packed in dry ice for 3 days before the undertakers took his body away. French law at the time required burial to occur within the jurisdiction of death, unless all permissions for transport were obtained. Local authorities demanded rigorous death registration and medical certification. Given that it was July, the weather was hot, and his body was not embalmed, a swift local burial minimized complications. Courson reportedly informed the American embassy that Morrison had no immediate family. This was to ensure a quick, no questions asked burial. Okay, in 2007, another version of Jim Morrison's last hours surfaced. The former manager of the rock and roll circus, Sam Bennett, claimed that Morrison had died in a toilet stall at the club of a heroin overdose, and his body had been removed and taken to his apartment to avoid a scandal. Singer Marianne Faithfull later claimed that the overdose was given to Morrison by her then-boyfriend, Count Jean de Breteuil. Others claimed that Morrison hated needles and did not do heroin at all. A few months after Morrison's death, Jean de Breteuil died of an overdose, and in 1974, back in America, Pam Courson suffered the same fate. Back at Père Lachaise, Morrison's grave, at first barely marked, soon became the most visited grave in the cemetery. In 1981, a headstone was crafted by a Croatian artist, which I saw. However, it was stolen in 1988. In 1990, Morrison's grave was renovated and a new curb and headstone installed. Cemetery officials erected metal barricades around the site. The last flat stone laid on the grave was organized by Morrison's father in 1990 and has a Greek inscription which reads, "True to his own spirit." So we know that Jim Morrison died that July night, but under what circumstances? At the time, the police concluded that the singer had died of a heart attack. Given Morrison's medical history, law enforcement assumed that his excesses had been the cause of his death, and in a way, they certainly were. So let's compress the two generally accepted versions of his demise. According to Pam Courson, Jim Morrison had been drinking all day. That evening, they went out to see a film, they had some dinner, and they went to bed. Around 3 a.m., she recounts being awakened by sounds of Jim gasping for air, and he was vomiting blood. He told her he was fine and went off to take a bath. After a while, he seemed better, and she went to sleep. When she awoke that morning, or perhaps shortly after, she couldn't find him. She went to the bathroom, where she found him unconscious in the bathtub. She could not revive him or get him out of the water, so she called Alain Ronet, a close friend of Jim's. He arrived a short time later, and it was he who called emergency services. A Dr. Max Vasile arrived about 45 minutes later, and he pronounced Morrison dead from a heart attack. This version has often been disputed because Pam Courson gave several versions, and therein lays the foundation of the mystery, I believe. And we have the version of Jim Morrison dying of an overdose in the toilets of the Rock and Roll Circus nightclub. Having come to buy heroin for Pam Courson, he went to test the drug in the toilets. When he didn't return, the bar owner had the toilet door forced open and found him unconscious. Morrison had taken heroin. The drugs had been supplied by men working for the Count. The owner, wishing to avoid a scandal, had Morrison rolled onto a carpet and taken out through a nearby club. He was brought back to Rue Beautreillis, where they plunged him into a bathtub of ice water to try and restart his heart. These two theories are the most widespread today. Even Jim Morrison's close friends and family tend to favor the overdose hypothesis rather than cardiac arrest. But others have very different, sometimes more conspiratorial theories. According to Marianne Faithfull, who was also John Brettwheel's partner at the time, she believed he deliberately killed Jim Morrison by providing him with a dose of pure and therefore fatal heroin. De Brettwheel fled to Morocco immediately after the incident, where he himself died a year later, also from an overdose. However, she does not elaborate on why Brettwheel would have wanted to murder Jim Morrison. I totally discount that theory. The theory of a conspiracy has also been raised, that at the time the CIA was supposedly trying to eliminate all those representing the American counterculture in the context of the Vietnam War. I regard this theory as completely absurd. Some people even consider the theory of suicide by overdose. Indeed, Jim Morrison had been deeply affected by the deaths of members of the 27 Club, the infamous group comprised of music celebrities who died at the age of 27. And by 1971, they had three new members: Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. Incidentally, we have episodes on all three personalities at Serious Rock Talk Crime. All these musicians were close to Morrison. And at the time, when he drank with friends, he would tell them, "You're looking at number 4. So, had he planned to take his own life? Doubtful. In fact, he went to Paris to get rid of the drugs and alcohol. Finally, could Jim Morrison have faked his death? Ray Manzarek, the Doors keyboard player, fueled this theory. He supported it by suggesting that if Morrison wanted to end his life as a rock star, wouldn't he just have faked his death to be free of it? Manzarek even wrote a book about a famous rock star who faked his death, went to an island, and found peace. What do I believe? Likely Pam Courson's version is closest to the truth. At the time of his death, Morrison was in terrible physical shape. If there were irregularities such as Pam and her friends purposely giving an incorrect name to the coroner to protect Jim's identity and cleaning the drugs out of the apartment so they wouldn't be found by police, they're understandable. Those are not grounds for a conspiracy. Doors organist Manzarek kept alive the Jim faked his death theory, much to the consternation of fellow Doors members Robbie Krieger and John Densmore. After Manzarek died, Krieger expressed dismay about this theory, but said that Manzarek's life was dedicated to keeping the Doors together, to keeping them alive, and he did a great job at that. And it is quite likely Jim Morrison died of a heart attack brought on by years of abuse to his body and a previously existing condition. It's not that far-fetched. Morrison was buried quickly and somewhat anonymously because his friends did not want to see the graveside circuses that surrounded the deaths of Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and Brian Jones. And they were successful in this. When Doors manager Bill Siddons arrived in Paris, one thing he noticed was that the casket was sealed. He never saw Jim Morrison dead. He didn't want to, he said. After that, many thought, well, that's because Jim Morrison was not in that casket. Given the situation that Morrison had been on dry ice for 3 days, it's not unreasonable to put the body in a sealed casket. But the mystery will not go away. At the beginning, I mentioned that, and I think it has a lot to do with not just the way Jim Morrison died, but the nature of the Doors' music and the nature of Jim Morrison. Together, these forces propel a kind of self-sustaining mythology. So those thousands and thousands of visitors who every year visit Jim Morrison at Père Lachaise are energized by the myth. And that makes sense. It's in no way morbid, but just a gathering of the tribes, those who want to share the music and mythology. I expect, unlike Jim Morrison, it will last a long time. This is Dr. Ian Clarke, and you have been listening to Serious Rock Talk Crime. As always, the beat goes on.